And Bill Owens is with us, a consultant and expert in U.S.-Canada trade and former congressman. Nice to have you.
Glad to be here, Tom.
Was this a surprise after the deal with Mexico was announced in August? It didn't seem the talks were going all that well.
Absolutely. I was on my way to a conference in D.C. thinking that the conversation would be about what are we going to do when we don't have NAFTA. Arrived down there, and Sunday night it was announced they had a deal, changed the whole tenor of the conversation at the conference, and it shifted to we now have a new agreement, and how's this going to play out?
Reporters in Canada say that the breakthrough came on Saturday when American negotiators offered to keep Chapter 19, which is the long-established means of resolving disputes. And they say that was very important to Canadians, and then that things fell in place quickly after that.
The Canadians made it very clear that one of their bright lines was Chapter 19, and the Americans very much pushing for a resolution of the milk issue. And so those two things seem to somehow make their way to the table and be resolved. That gave both parties a decent political win, and I think allowed the deal to move forward.
With Canada on board, the U.S. will back away from threatening tariffs on auto parts and autos made in Canada.
That's right, and that's included in the deal. I think it's also important to note, though, that this deal currently is a handshake. Nothing has been signed as yet.
And Congress still has to approve it.
And Congress still has to approve it.
But the tariffs on steel and aluminum stay.
That's right.
Do you think that's just temporarily until there's a finalized deal, or do you think that eventually they'll get lifted?
I think that President Trump is holding those cards in his breast pocket, sort of something right out of the art of the deal. He's going to hold that to make sure that the agreement is signed and confirmed by the parliaments and congresses of the three countries. Once that happens, I think he will in fact remove those tariffs and we'll go back to normal. Some people might say it would be a sign of good faith to allow those tariffs to be withdrawn. I think he wants to make sure he gets this deal done, and he needs that not just for the Canadians, but he needs it for the members of Congress, because many of their districts rely on Canadian aluminum and steel for the businesses located there. So it's a leverage point at many levels.
And you mentioned that it has to be approved by the three countries. Could this be a tough sell in Canada? A number of people are unhappy. They feel that Trudeau and the government sold out on the dairy farmers.
Well, many of the Canadians I spoke to in Washington were saying that this could be a tough sell. You also have the fact that in Quebec, we moved to a center-right government, defeating the Liberals. Ontario has lost its liberal government. So, the country may be shifting a bit, and whether Trudeau has the political clout to push it through remains to be seen.
As far as the concessions on dairy, this will open Canada up to more U.S. imports. A small percentage, but still a big deal?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a slight increase in the numbers. So it is a big deal because it will adversely affect some Canadian dairy farmers, but you also have to put it in perspective of what that represents in terms of all of NAFTA trade, and it's a relatively small number.
And is it good for North Country farmers? Will they be able to sell more milk across the border?
Absolutely, and it also, when you think about it, that market is 50 miles away. Other markets are many, many, many more miles away. So this is a good deal for American dairy, particularly in upstate New York.
And how does this new deal affect the many cross-border businesses and manufacturing here in the North Country?
I think if NAFTA had been terminated, we would have had a period of chaos while we figured out what the rules of the game are. This gives us consistency going forward. We know that we're going to have basically the same rules, and I think that it will continue to facilitate trade.
With the deal, do you think all is forgotten? The disastrous G7 summit, Trump calling Trudeau weak and dishonest, or do you think this has soured U.S.-Canada relations?
I think at the governmental level, there's probably going to be some aftertaste. I think for the average American, the average Canadian, it's not going to have any impact whatsoever in how they conduct their business.
You mentioned the historic election in Quebec this week. Were you surprised by the CAQ and its big win?
Actually, yes. I thought that, Couillard had done a good job economically. He appeared to be governing well, but, this is one of those elections where they basically said, look, the Liberals have been in power for, I think, 15 out of the last 17 years. We need a change.
So after 50 years of the Liberals and PQ being in power, this is a new upstart party. Francois Legault will be the new premier. Do we know much about him?
Well, I only know what I've read recently in the newspapers. He is clearly, they're calling him center right. I think he's a little bit further right than that. A good example is he's proposing that anyone who immigrates to Quebec has to take a language and a culture test after 3 years, and if they don't pass, they have to leave. Now, whether or not he can actually implement that under the Canadian Constitution, I think is very questionable, but nonetheless, it gives you the mindset of where he's at.
And unlike many of the other provincial elections in Quebec over the past few decades, the issue of sovereignty wasn't on the front burner in this one.
Was not, and it appears the PQ has really, I would say, collapsed in terms of its ability to bring that issue forward.
And with Couillard being a Liberal, and does this now, as you mentioned, with him being right of center, change the dynamics between relations between Quebec and New York and Vermont and New England states?
I don't think it has any impact ultimately on our relationship. I mean, Legault understands that he has a province that is heavily engaged in exports, and he needs to make sure he maintains that. So I don't think there'll be any significant change. I think the real issue is going to be between the Legault government and the Federalist. How that plays out between he and Trudeau will be more interesting than I think what happens between New York, Vermont, and Quebec.